Okay, contracts class, paragraph 7, we're going to talk about the property condition. The first thing we're going to talk about is access, inspections, and utilities. This paragraph just basically says that the seller is going to give the buyer and the buyer's agent the right to inspect the property at reasonable times. A lot of times this paragraph is misunderstood. A lot of agents will say, well, you did your inspections, we've already scheduled that, you cannot go back and inspect the property again. No, that's not what it says. You can inspect it as long as the buyer and seller agree. If you want to inspect it at 6 o'clock in the morning, that's probably not a reasonable time. So come up with a reasonable time and you can inspect the property. It also says that the buyer can choose to have the property inspected by somebody that's licensed by TREC or otherwise permitted by law to do the inspection, and that the existing utilities need to be turned on and kept on during the time of the contract. So you probably want to make sure that if you represent the seller and the utilities are turned off, that they are turned on in time for the inspection and that the utilities remain on. Now, this is just existing utilities. So if the property currently has water and electricity and you want to do a gas test, well, that's not going to happen because it doesn't currently have gas. All right, paragraph 7B talks about the seller's disclosure, and this is a requirement of the Texas Property Code that the seller provides the buyer with a seller's disclosure. And there are a couple of exceptions to that, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. You have three choices. The first choice is that the buyer has received the notice. If you represent the seller, that's probably the best option to have checked, because if you go to paragraph 2, excuse me, you're going to give the buyer an out 7 days to terminate after they get the notice. So when you get that notice, I don't know why agents don't just automatically load that into MLS, put it under media so that the buyer's agent will have that readily available when they're ready to write a contract. The buyer can have the opportunity to initial and sign that they did receive the notice, and then that box is checked and you're on your way. Don't have to worry about it. All right, the next one says that the buyer has not received the notice, but within X number of days after the effective date of the contract, the seller is going to deliver the notice. If the buyer does not receive the notice, the buyer may terminate this contract at any time prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded. So if they don't ever get it, they can terminate. Or if the seller delivers the notice, the buyer may terminate this contract for any reason within 7 days after the buyer receives the notice or prior to closing, whichever first occurs, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So, Mr. Seller's agent, you're giving that buyer an out if that paragraph 2 is checked and not paragraph 1. And then the third paragraph 3 says the seller is not required to furnish the notice under the Texas Property Code. So if you go to section 5.008 of the Texas Property Code, it lists, I think there's 10 or 11 reasons why a seller doesn't have to provide a seller's disclosure. The ones that you'll use the most are if it's a foreclosure, if it's an estate never lived in, or if it's a new home construction, then the seller's not required to provide the seller's disclosure. And the others are just things like if you're selling the house to a spouse, like if it's a divorce situation, you're selling it from one spouse to the other person's spouse or soon to be ex-spouse, you wouldn't be required to provide that seller's disclosure. All right, number C. Well, before we move off of this, let's talk about why there are so many different seller's disclosures, which one's right and which one's wrong. There's no really right or wrong, but this is what happened. The Texas Real Estate Commission, TREC, They went to the Texas Property Code, and in the Texas Property Code, it has outlined everything that must be disclosed by law. So TREC said, okay, we're going to make our form, and we're going to include everything that the law requires the seller to disclose. And then the Texas Association of Realtors says, hey, that's great. We're going to disclose everything that the law says we have to disclose, plus we're going to add some other items that it would probably be a good idea if the seller went ahead and disclosed those items as well. Metrotex or Netris, they said, well, TAR did a good job, but maybe these other things would be nice to be disclosed. So they had their own disclosure. Some brokerages like Ebby and Virginia Cook, they have their own disclosure. Now, Ebby and Virginia Cook, probably they've been sued for one of those things. So they said, okay, we're going to have our own disclosure. We're going to disclose everything that the law says we have to. We're probably going to disclose everything that TAR recommends that we disclose. And then we're going to disclose these other things as well. So the one that you use, it really doesn't matter. You're not going to be using the Virginia Cook or the Ebby one, but you can either use the TREC one or the TAR one, either one. I prefer the TAR, but you know, as long as you make the disclosures, that's good. And then you want to encourage your sellers to complete that document in its entirety. Don't leave anything blank. Don't answer every question, and don't tell them what to put down. You know, just tell them, answer the question. It's for the majority on the first page and a half is either yes, no, or unknown, and then yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. So, you know, does this property have a French drain? Well, why are you asking me? Well, I don't know if it has a French drain. Well, yes, no, unknown. Okay. Paragraph 7C talks about the lead-based paint disclosure. Basically, any property built prior to 1978, you need to provide a lead-based paint disclosure. This form is constantly filled out incorrectly. Okay, this form is a federal form, has nothing to do with the state of Texas. There's no law in the state of Texas regarding disclosing lead-based paint, but this federal law is pretty stringent. Anything built before 1978, you have to make the disclosure. The seller has some questions that they have to answer. The buyer has some questions that they have to answer. The buyer has to sign it, date it. The buyer's agent has to sign it, date it. The seller has to sign it, date it. The seller's agent has to sign it, date it. To be done correctly, that form needs to be completed on or before the effective date of the contract, not after. If you fill that form out after the effective date of the contract, the EPA and HUD consider that form to be filled out incorrectly. Both agents could be subject to a fine. A lot of times I'll go through those forms when I'm approving the CDAs. A lot of agents will put in there that the seller has no information to provide, which is probably true. They probably don't. They probably were never provided with any information when they purchased the house. They've probably never had any tests run as far as lead or lead-based paint. So they have nothing to disclose. They have no reports to disclose. But when the buyer fills out their portion, they put that they've received the information. Oh, the information that the seller says they don't have, you received it. That doesn't make sense, guys. So don't check that box on the buyer side if the seller says, I have no information to give you, I have no reports to give you. Now, the box that you do need to check, and you do need to make sure that you've complied with that provision, is to give that buyer the pamphlet on the lead-based paint. It's about a 16-page pamphlet the last time I looked at it. It's out in zip form. You can just download it and give it to the buyer. If you know that it's built before 1978, you can give them that pamphlet at any time prior to completing that form. You could give it to them when you're doing your buyer consultation, if you know that you're going to be looking at a bunch of old houses. So go ahead and give it to them. Just make sure that they receive it. Now you might say, well, it's I represent the seller. It's not my responsibility. You read that paragraph. Both agents are responsible for that form being completed in its entirety, correct, signed, dated at the right time. Okay, we're constantly getting that form filled out incorrectly. So be careful. You're putting yourself at risk of being fined of $4,000. That's the fine. All right, this next paragraph sometimes causes a lot of grief. This as is provision. Okay, this contract is an as is contract. It always has been, more than likely it always will be. Okay. But the buyer has a heartburn. I don't want to accept this property as is. And you got to say, well, let's read on through this, and then you're going to see how you're going to have some protection, and that you'll be able to terminate the contract if you have an option, if you pay the fee, and if we get the check to the seller on time. So I want to read this one, make sure everybody's on board. Acceptance of property condition. As is means the present condition of the property with any and all defects and without warranties except for the warranties of title and the warranties in this contract. Buyer's agreement to accept the property as is under paragraph 7D1 or 2 does not preclude the buyer from inspecting the property under paragraph 7A, which we just talked about, from negotiating repairs or treatments in a subsequent amendment, or from terminating the contract during the option period, if any. So if you have an option period, even though it's an as-is contract, get your inspections done, try to negotiate the repairs. If you're not happy after the inspection or you cannot negotiate the repairs, opt out. You've got the right to do that. So it says check one box only. Buyer accepts the property as is. That's probably the one you'll check most of the time. Number 2 says the buyer accepts the property as is, provided the seller, at the seller's expense, shall complete the following specific repairs and treatments, and then you just list them. Now, this paragraph has been misinterpreted and misused so many times that TREC now has a very stern warning here. To me, this is like an admonishment where they say, do not insert general phrases such as subject to inspections that do not identify specific repairs and treatments. If you're going to put something in there, it has to be a specific repair or treatment that the buyer wants done. This is before even any inspections are completed. So let's say that here's a perfect example. The buyer's Mr. Handyman. You pull up to the house, he gets out of the car, first thing he looks at is the roof. He says, if they don't put a new roof on this house, I don't even want this house. They go inside, they like everything about the house, they want to write up a contract, they haven't done any inspections at anything whatsoever, but in the buyer's mind, the roof has to be replaced. So you would put that in number 2, seller to replace the roof. So if the seller doesn't want to do that, and the buyer doesn't want the house unless they do that, why go on? Why accept the contract? Just stop it right there. Or maybe you go into a room and 3 of the walls are painted white and 1 of the walls is painted red. You put in this provision here, number 2, the seller to paint the red wall white. That's something specific. That's a repair or treatment. If you don't want to do that, then maybe we don't want the house, okay? So just don't put anything general in there. And whatever you do, don't put that statement about we're accepting it as is, pending an inspection by a licensed inspector, subject to any repairs and blah, blah, blah. That's not what they're looking for. So keep that stuff out of there. All right, 7E deals with lender required repairs and treatments. All right, so these are not repairs that the buyer is asking for. These are repairs that the seller says, if you don't make these repairs, we're not going to loan the money. Now, where do they come up with this? Do they have an inspection done? No, they do not. What happens is when the appraiser goes out to appraise the property, if they notice something in the property that affects the current resident or a future resident, so that's something that they consider wrong with that property, they are required to let the lender know about that. And that's where the lender comes up with these lender required repairs. So what they're saying, if you don't do these repairs, we're not loaning you the money. Who has to pay for those repairs? Either party can pay for them, or they can say, the seller says, I'm not paying for all that stuff, and the buyer says, I'm not paying for it either. Okay, the paragraph says, we're going to terminate the contract. You're going to get your money back, all right? It goes on to say that if the repairs are very costly, if it exceeds 5% of the sales price, the buyer can still terminate the contract even if the seller says, I will pay for those repairs. The buyer can come back and say, no, that's too much. You know, it's over 5% of the sales price. I don't want the house anymore. So I'm going to terminate the contract. Even though you agree to pay for it, I'm going to terminate and get my money back. Okay. Completion of repairs and treatments. All right, let's look at this one. And let's make sure we understand. I want to read this and tell you. It's kind of lengthy, but bear with me. Unless otherwise agreed in writing, the seller shall complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to the closing date. And number two, all required permits must be obtained and repairs and treatments must be performed by persons who are licensed to provide such repairs or treatments, or if no license is required by law, are commercially engaged in the trade of providing such repairs or treatments. At buyer's elections, any transferable warranties received by the seller with respect to the repairs and treatments will be, if the seller fails to complete any agreed repairs and treatments prior to the closing date, the buyer may exercise remedies under paragraph 15 or extend the closing date up to 5 days if necessary for seller to complete the repairs and treatments. Now, one thing I would caution you on, if you represent a buyer and there's some stuff that needs to be done, and the buyer says, okay, I'll go ahead and pay for those, and then you can just pay me at closing. No, what if that thing never closes and the buyer's made all those repairs? You don't want to do that. When it talks about people that are licensed, if it's like a plumber or electrician that's required to make those repairs, they should be done by a licensed person. Now, is there a licensed person to fix holes in sheetrock? Not to my knowledge, there isn't, but there are people that are engaged in that kind of activity. So maybe a seller could do it, but maybe that seller's a CPA and they don't normally engage in fixing holes in sheetrocks. Should they do it? The answer is probably no, unless you agree to it in writing that it's okay, that very first sentence in the paragraph, okay? So these can be very, very, I'm searching for a word, very difficult when you get to talking about repairs and having them done and having the work inspected. You know, a lot of times it's much better if you can, is to go ahead and come up with an amount. Maybe you have $2,000 worth of repairs that you just modify or amend the contract that the seller is going to pay $2,000 of the buyer's closing costs, or they're going to reduce the price by $2,000, or come up with something outside of the alternative. So you guys got me all choked up. Okay, sorry about that. Will paragraph 7 ever end? Yes, it will. Just got a couple more little things to go over here. Paragraph 7G deals with environmental matters. It says that the buyer is advised that the presence of either wetland, toxic substance, including asbestos and waste, or other environmental hazards or the presence of a threatened or endangered species or its habitat may affect the buyer's intended use of the property. If the buyer is concerned about these matters, an addendum promulgated by TREC or required by the parties should be used. So if you're out in the country somewhere and you think that there's a problem with wetlands or endangered species or some type of hazardous waste materials, or used to be where this house is located, there used to be a service station and they had 30,000 gallon tank buried under the ground that might cause some problems. The buyer can elect to have these tests run at their expense, and if there's a problem, they can choose to opt out of the contract. So you would just prepare that amendment and then list it in paragraph 22 and then be on your way. Okay, this is the last paragraph in paragraph 7. It's paragraph 7H. It has to do with residential service contracts. It says that the buyer may purchase a residential service contract from a residential service company licensed by TREC. If the buyer purchases a residential service contract, the seller shall reimburse the buyer at closing for the cost of the residential service contract in the amount not exceeding, and then you put an amount in there. Buyer should review any residential service contracts for the scope of coverage, exclusions, and limitations. Now, before we go on, there's a bunch of different companies. We are partnered with American Home Shield. They do a great job. I would not try to interpret what's covered and what's not. Call the rep, in our case on American Home Shield. Call Sheila. Have the buyer call Sheila. Have Sheila explain to them in detail, which she can easily do, what's covered. Don't put yourself in that position of interpreting what's covered in that home warranty. All right, and then it goes on to say in bold print, so they're trying to draw your eyes to this sentence. The purchase of a residential service contract is optional. Similar coverage may be purchased from various companies authorized to do business in Texas. So there's a whole bunch of them. It's always a good idea that they have a home warranty if they pay for it themselves. If you cannot negotiate for the seller to pay, it's probably a good investment for the buyer to go ahead and pay, have that little bit of coverage, and it probably mitigates some of your risk also that they do have coverage. Okay, that's the end of paragraph 7. We're going to take a break. I'll try to get my voice back. Looking over the next few paragraphs, we're probably going to cover several of these just for a matter of time, because these aren't going to take that long. See you at the next session. Thank you.